Hello, I'm Brian Lesueur from Xenix Software. I'd like to thank Appian for inviting me to present this year at Elevate 2022. And I'm going to take you through a presentation about best practices for PowerBuilder and PowerServer automated testing. Quick disclaimer, this presentation was authored by me, a volunteer in the Appian community, and it does not express the views of Appian at all. These are my views and opinions. Here's my session agenda. I'm going to explain the two different ways that we can hook into a PowerBuilder or PowerServer application so that we can create automated tests. I'm going to talk about how to define a tabbed MDIChild window, because most of you know that in most PowerBuilder applications you will find tabbed windows. I'm also going to talk about how to enable a feature that we call render text, which allows Essential Test, our automated testing tool, to see text that doesn't necessarily have a handle, it's not a real object, as an object. And you'll see why as I start to present why that's useful in automated testing of a PowerBuilder or PowerServer application. I'm going to talk about how to define the new ribbon window. I'm also going to dive into the data window and show you how you can get the number of rows in a data window at runtime, how to get all the values of a data window row, how to get the values in a column in a data window, and then finally how to get the contents of an entire data window. All these things are useful when you're driving an automated test. Finally, I'm going to talk about a newer feature which allows the testing tool, Essential Test, to be able to test an embedded Chrome inside of a PowerBuilder or PowerServer application. And of course I'll be around after the presentation to take on any questions that you might have. First, quickly about me. As you can see, my skills are primarily around automated testing, about test tool development and about automated testing. And my most recent project was getting out the release of Essential Test 9.9, which just came out in September. Xenix Software, where I'm from, is the creator of Essential Test. It's an enterprise-level test management system that encompasses test planning, test development, test data management, and execution. What we try to do is provide a testing solution where users can build robust manual and automated testing from reusable components that are created without recording or scripting. We have very good support for PowerBuilder, PowerServer applications, and so there's quite a number of you that out there in the Appian world that use Essential Test to test your target applications. I'm going to start out by talking about how we hook into a target application, because in order to learn about the objects and be able to interact with the objects, this is the graphical user interface part of your application. In order to be able to do that, we need to hook into the target application. And there's a couple of ways to do that. There's a test API that's enabled through registry settings, and then there's something called FNX that you can just turn on inside of your PowerBuilder profile. So let me talk about those two methods. The first is using your registry. If you go to your registry and you have a PowerBuilder application installed on your application, you're going to find in Computer, HKey Current User, Software, Sybase PowerBuilder, and then the number of the version of PowerBuilder. You're going to find that each one of those versions has this key called Enable Test API. In order to use the registry to hook in to that test API, or to enable Essential Test to hook in to the target application, you need to make sure that this is set to 1. It might be set to 0 by default, but you want to make sure that's set to 1. If you do that, then you're going to see that Essential Test will be able to capture your objects and interact with the target application through the test API. One thing to note here, and if you're looking carefully, you'll notice I have a 19.1 and a 19.2, but not a 19.3, which would be R3. And the reason for that is that for R3, the 19.0 was used to enable the test API. I think that's probably because the runtimes were separated from the graphical user interface components of PowerBuilder at that time. So that's one way to hook up Essential Test to a PowerBuilder or PowerServer target application. The other way to do it is through our UA server. And so UA server has what we call an extension that you create for your application, and you can see that I have created one for PowerBuilder 2022. Like I said, I'm using the most recent version of PowerBuilder for this demonstration, and you can see we're hooked into that process. I've got it running behind here. You can't see it yet, but you'll be seeing it in a little while. If I double click on that, you see that I'm hooked into pb220.exe, and the way to enable the PowerBuilder extension using FNX is simply to come into the application profile and just click Use FNX. Typically when folks are evaluating Essential Test, taking out a trial to test their PowerBuilder applications, this is the way we usually instruct people to do it because it's easier. You don't have to go find it in the registry. Now, folks often ask, well, which is better, since you have two choices? I have found through doing support and supporting a lot of PowerBuilder customers over the years, I think the enabling the extension through the registry does seem to be a little bit more stable. It's not that FNX is problematic, it's not. Almost all applications will work the same way with FNX as the extension enabled through the registry, but there's a couple of rare occasions where you might have some difficulty with some data windows when you're using FNX. And invariably when that comes to support and we have you switched to using the registry, then the issue is usually resolved. So I would say that that's more stable, and I do recommend that when customers start to use Essential Test for real after the trial, that they go ahead and enable it through the registry. Now the next topic that I want to talk about is how to define a tabbed window. We see these kinds of windows in most PowerBuilder applications. And so what I want to do is I want to show you what we consider the best practice for defining those types of objects. So you'll see in a moment when I demonstrate, I'm going to define, in this case, a dialog box, but also an MDIChild would be done exactly the same way. And then I'm going to define the tab group, which allows Essential Test to navigate from tab to tab. Each tabbed window would then be a child of the dialog box or MDIChild. So instead of creating a separate top-level window, we're going to have the tabbed windows be children of the dialog box or MDIChild. And then finally, the elements are nested inside of each tabbed window. So let's have a quick look. Here I've got one done already for you. We have a definition of this dialog box, and you can see that this is a tabbed dialog. The dialog has several tabs. Now in this particular example, each one of the tabbed windows happens to be a PB table, but it could just as well be a PB form, or it could even be a window of another class with elements inside of it. The next thing that I have defined here is the tab group. So that's these tabs up top, and you'll see that as I click on them, they all light up. Now that would be important because if we were executing an automated test and we needed to get from tab to tab, we would need those objects in order to click on them in order to move from tab to tab. Inside of the dialog box, we then have the actual tab. And in this case, you see we have the Databases tab, which happens to have a PB table located in it. On this snapshot, we see the Documentation tab. And again, there's a PB table. I'm not going to do all of them for you, but I want to show you how you can do one of them. Here on the Framework tab, I could take that table and drag it over and drop it, and then simply rename it so that it makes sense. I'm going to call it Framework, which is the name of the tab. And you'll see that inside of there are all the rows and all the columns in the row. So this is the way that we consider the best way to define a tabbed window for automation. Now let's talk about how we would define the ribbon window in Essential Tester, that ribbon tab. Before I do that, I want to talk about another feature that we're going to use in order to define that ribbon tab. We have something in Essential Test called render text. Render text allows us to see text in an application, and in our case a PowerBuilder application, that doesn't have a handle. It's not a heavy control where it would have an H-wind. Yet the text is important because it allows us to identify objects. So the way that we turn on this render text feature is we go to our UA server and we find our application profile. In this case, I'm going to go to my PowerBuilder 2022, and I'm going to scroll down in the application profile to the section called render text and make sure that that's checked. That enables this feature called render text. Once we do that, we can then define the ribbon. So the first step to defining the ribbon window would be to enable the render text as I just showed you. Then we're going to define the main window of the target application. And we're going to drag over the ribbon window as a PB toolbar object in a similar way that we used to do the old PB toolbar. Now we can define the ribbon window sections because, as most of you know, the ribbon windows have sections. Some customers I've seen do define the sections and others do not. It doesn't really matter. It'll work either way. And then we're going to define each one of the tools on that toolbar, ribbon window, using either render text or render image. And I've got some examples of both. So let's take a look. So here we have a snapshot in Essential Test of the main window of our sales example. And you can see in the Elements panel here we have the ribbon window, and I clicked on it, and that's why it's lit up in yellow here. Now I've already defined it. I did that just by dragging it over and dropping it, and you see that what's defined is what we call a PB toolbar, and I named mine Ribbonbar. And then all I needed to do is just drag the text over and drop it, and you can see it as I click on it, it lights up. And again, I got that just by taking the text and just dragging it over and dropping it. I could do it like that and it'll define another one for me. So it's just drag and drop. Now you'll notice in the ribbon bar that I could have defined the sections because we do see each one of the sections. You can see the view section, the action section, and so forth. I chose not to split my ribbon bar up into sections in this particular case. I would only do that if there were the same named tools in the different sections, and then I would use the hierarchy to differentiate between the same named or similarly named tools in the two different sections. In this case, I didn't have that, so I simply took all of the tools and I defined them directly on the ribbon bar. Next, I want to talk about how we can get information from the data window at runtime when we're running an automated test. First thing we're going to do is talk about how we can get the number of rows in a data window. There's actually a couple of ways to do it. You can use a built-in property or you can use a built-in attribute. I'm going to show you an example using a property. So here we are in Essential Test. We've got a table right here and we want to get the number of rows in this table. And the way that we can do that is we can click here on the table so that it lights up in the snapshot. And then down below, we can select Get from our radio button here. And what I want to do is I want to get the number of rows. And then I can simply insert that into my test. It gets me the number of rows. And then I can print the value that's returned. So I'll put that here like that. And when I run this test, it's going to give me the number of rows in this table. So it's quite easy to do, as you can see. Another thing that I might want to get from a data window is I might want to get all the values in a row. So what we've done is we've got something called a get record, or a record get, I should say, that I'm going to show you how you can enable that in Essential Test. Then we can select the row either using an index or using a string selector. I'm going to use a string selector. And then I'm going to use a property called values. And that property, values, is going to give me the values of all of the cells or columns in the data window. So let's have a look at that. So here we are back in Essential Test, and you can see I've got a step that I've already got created for you. I don't have to do it manually anymore because you've seen how you can drag and drop. And we've got our data table over here. And so what we want to do is we want to get all the values in one of these data table rows. And I just arbitrarily selected row 1701. You can see I've identified it by the ID here. So I'm saying customer, which is the name of the window, dot customers, which is the name of the table, dot row, and then I'm selecting by the ID, in this case 1701, and I'm using the values property. And then I'm simply printing what got returned. So if I run it, you can see that what we've returned is the value of all the columns in that data table row. So it would be this row right here. So you can see 1701, individual retail customer, Dorothy B. Robinson, etc. So that's how we can get the values of a row in a data table. Something related, we might want to get all of the values of a column in a data window. So here you're going to see I'm going to use a selector, but I'm going to use a selector called all because I want to access all of the rows in the data table, but I want to get at a specific column. So I'm going to use get text or text in order to get the value of the column. So I could actually use either get text, which is an action, or I could use the text property. Either way is going to get me the value of the column. So let's take a look at that. So here I've got the statement again already constructed. I'm saying customer.customers.row, and again I'm using all because I want to get the column for all of the rows in the data table when we already know from an earlier exercise that there are 100 rows in this data table. I want to get the last name column, so that's the column right here. And remember, I said I could either say get text, which would be an action, or I could use the text property, either way. And I'm going to be capturing those values into this list of string that I call col values or column values, and then I'll print it. So if I run this, you can see that we're going to get the last name for every single row, the last name column for every single row in the data table. So there's going to be 100 of them. I might also want to capture the contents of the entire data window. So I've already showed you how we can enable the record get. I'm going to use that record get again that I used earlier when I wanted to get the values of the data table row. And here I'm going to use the rows value property on the PB table. I could have also used the value property on the PB table. Either way would get me the same result. So what I want to do here is I want to capture all of the values, the contents of that data window, and in this case I actually want to verify it. I want to save it, store it as a baseline, so every time I run the test I could compare back to that baseline. So let's have a look at that one. Now this one might look a little different, because here I've done a verify, and you can see the statement being formed right here. Verify customer values, and the way I got it was simply by appending it, by clicking the append button like that. But what's interesting about this statement is it actually stores all of the values of the table in, it's stored in this little icon here, or represented by this little icon here, and stored in the table. And again, this is a baseline. So every time I run this test, it's going to go out to the target application and get the values that are currently in the table and compare them back to the baseline. So when I run it, you'll see that we get a result. It says that the verification passed, meaning that the values here in the table at runtime actually matched what was stored in the baseline. And if I want to see that, I can double click on this little icon here, and up pops this difference viewer. Now if there was an error, I would be able to see it in the difference viewer. It would shade in red anything that was different between the expected result, which is what's stored in the baseline, and the actual result, which is what is captured from the data window at runtime. The last topic that I'd like to cover is how to test an embedded CEF. So for a long time, you were able to embed in an Internet Explorer in your PowerBuilder applications, but more recently Appian has provided the way to embed a Chromium in your PowerBuilder and PowerServer applications. And so Essential Test now supports that as well. And the way to do that is to make sure that you're using the pb web browser.dll that's provided by Appian. Make sure that that's included in the build of your PowerBuilder application. And then have the developer set the remote debugging port. It's through this remote debugging port that Chrome or Google has provided a way to hook into an embedded CEF. So this is an industry standard for hooking into an embedded CEF or Chromium. I'll show you now how you can indicate that remote debugging port to Essential Test through the UA Server application profile. So you would bring up UA Server and you would find your application profile. In my case, it's this PowerBuilder 2022. And if you scroll down toward the bottom, you'll see that there's a section called Chromium. You would click or check the checkbox here for an embedded Chromium, and then you would indicate whatever that remote debugging port is that the developer set. Make sure that that matches whatever the remote debugging port that was set by the developer. Once you do that and you take a snapshot of your PowerBuilder application with a Chrome browser embedded, you will see in the Essential Test snapshot that we also see right alongside of the PowerBuilder elements. So we're looking here at a snapshot, and you can see there's a PB Compute right there, so you can see this is a PowerBuilder application. In fact, it's a page in the order entry system. And but if you look down through the elements tree here, you will see there is the CEF browser window. And inside the CEF browser window, we have a web page. And inside that web page, instead of looking at PowerBuilder elements, you're going to see web elements. So you see there's a web push button and a web list and so on and so forth. So I've defined some of the objects here, and you can see them as I click on them. They will light up. So here's a bunch of links that were captured inside of this web table. Again, a CEF embedded in your PowerBuilder application, but you can test it with Essential Test just like you could test any of your PowerBuilder elements. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be around after the presentation, after the recorded presentation, to answer any questions that you might have about automated testing of a PowerBuilder application. Thanks for your time. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation.